Good afternoon. Before we begin, we would just like to announce that due to the weather forecast for tomorrow and to allow everyone extra time to arrive, the hearing will start at 9:30. And now we'll hear the presentation of the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association. Please introduce yourself and you may begin.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Good afternoon, Chairperson Scott, Vice Chair Leisner, Commissioners, Commission staff, and Council. My name is Robert Giz, and I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association. To my right is Eric Smith, Senior Vice President of the CWTA, and to my left is Catherine Winchester, CWTA's Vice President of Operations. CWTA is the recognized authority on wireless issues, developments, and trends in Canada. In addition to promoting the importance and benefits of wireless connectivity in Canada, CWTA also facilitates a number of industry councils and committees, as well as consumer-facing programs, such as Mobile Giving Foundation Canada, wirelessaccessibility.ca, Device Check Canada, and Recycle My Cell. We appreciate having the opportunity to participate in this important proceeding and to appear before you today. Dans son avis d'audience, le Conseil a déclaré que le principal objectif de l'audience était de s'assurer que son cadre réglementaire favorise une concurrence durable qui donnera lieu à des tarifs raisonnables et à des services novateurs, ainsi que des investissements contenus dans des réseaux sans fil mobile de haute qualité dans toutes les régions du pays. Le Conseil demande aux intervenants de déterminer s'ils répondent aux besoins des Canadiens et atteignent les objectifs stratégiques énoncés dans la loi. Autrement dit, il convient d'examiner la santé globale de la concurrence dans le marché de détail en tenant compte de sa capacité à produire des résultats entendus plutôt qu'en tenant compte de résultats statistiques comme le nombre ou le type de concurrents. Le gouvernement fédéral a clairement défini les besoins des Canadiens en matière de services sans fil mobile dans le document intitulé « Perspectives du spectre de 2018 à 2022 ». Reconnaissant que le Canada dispose d'une infrastructure de télécommunications de classe mondiale, le gouvernement déclare qu'il verra à ce que les consommateurs, les entreprises et les établissements publics canadiens continuent de bénéficier des applications et des services avancés de télécommunications sans fil. Pour parvenir à ce résultat, le gouvernement a cerné 3 principaux objectifs: qualité, couverture et prix abordable.
These objectives of quality, coverage, and affordable prices are not controversial. They reflect the policy objectives in the Telecommunications Act, are consistent with the Commission's stated focus, and are shared by CWTA and its members. The question is, what is the right path to achieving these goals? To quote the Competition Bureau from its appearance before you last week, facilities-based competition should be the guiding principle for the path forward. Why? Because facilities-based competition is working. Facilities-based competition is widely recognized as the market structure best capable of delivering sustainable competition and encouraging the level of investment in network infrastructure that is necessary to achieve desired outcomes for Canadians. It is driving more intense competition, growth in wireless adoption, increased data consumption, declining prices, and more choices for consumers. Equally important, continuing innovation and investment by Canada's facilities-based carriers is providing Canada with some of the fastest and highest quality networks in the world, as well as expanding network coverage. Despite this success, in the Notice of Consultation, the Commission expressed its concern that an appropriate mix of facilities-based competitors and MVNOs has not developed, and that it might be appropriate to mandate wholesale MVNO access. We strongly disagree. A low number of MVNOs is not an indication of a competition problem. In fact, as expert witness in this proceeding attests, the number of MVNOs in any particular country is largely irrelevant when it comes to assessing competitive intensity and positive consumer outcomes. The Commission's preliminary view on mandating wholesale MVNO access comes at a critical time in the evolution of the wireless market in Canada. The Commission and the federal government have placed the expansion of both wired and wireless coverage to underserved Canadians near the top of their agendas. They've also stressed the importance of investing in next-generation 5G wireless technologies. Yet a mandated wholesale MVNO access regime would undermine both of these objectives, with little, if any, corresponding benefits. First, the reduction in capacity to invest brought on by mandated MVNO wholesale access would be disproportionately borne by Canadians in rural and remote areas where the economics of network deployment are already challenging. By way of example, existing wholesale internet access regimes have already forced national and regional providers to suspend certain planned investments into smaller communities where the wholesale regime would impede them from obtaining a reasonable return on investment. It is notable that if facilities-based carriers no longer have the capital to expand and upgrade networks in less populated areas, residents of those areas will not receive any of the alleged benefits that come with the mandating of wholesale MVNO access.
With respect to 5G, the Commission has correctly stated that, with the introduction of 5G wireless technology, the wireless market is, and I quote, on the verge of a major transformation, and that wireless carriers will be required to make significant investments in network infrastructure. 5G will bring more than improved and faster wireless communications. 5G will expand the capabilities of wireless communications through the use of different bands of spectrum, new technologies, and a more intelligent and dynamic wireless network. The impact of 5G extends well beyond the wireless industry. It will be an indispensable platform for innovation, increased economic prosperity, and improved quality of life, and countries that do not recognize the importance of 5G will fall behind their international counterparts. The deployment of 5G in Canada will add an estimated $40 billion in GDP to the economy by 2026 and create close to 250,000 new permanent full-time jobs in that same timeframe. Beyond these macroeconomic factors, 5G will provide benefits to cities and rural communities and improve the quality of life of Canadians, including helping to fight climate change and extending network connectivity to underserved rural communities. However, deploying 5G will require massive investments by facilities-based wireless providers. According to Accenture, this level of necessary investment is estimated to be $26 billion by 2026. This does not include the several billions more that is likely to be spent by facilities-based wireless providers from 2020 to 2022 in the upcoming 3,500 megahertz millimeter wave and 3,800 megahertz spectrum auctions.
Mandating wholesale MVNO access will reduce facilities-based carriers' capacity to invest in 5G infrastructure and spectrum, threatening Canada's leadership role in wireless telecommunications and hampering Canadians' access to the latest mobile innovations, which are vital to increasing productivity, growing the economy, creating jobs, and improving Canadians' quality of life. Finally, while mandating MVNO access to facilities-based carriers' networks would negatively impact investment by all facilities-based carriers, regional providers will be particularly harmed. In CRTC 2015-177, which set out the current wholesale wireless roaming framework, the Commission acknowledged the important role that the regional providers are playing in bringing sustainable competition to the wireless retail market. Mandating MVNO wholesale access would effectively pull the rug out from under the regional providers, threatening their capacity to contribute to sustainable competition as independent network operators. It would instead favor economically inefficient MVNOs whose business model is dependent on gaining regulated access to the national carrier networks. As we have discussed in our written interventions, mandating MVNO access will not improve consumer outcomes, nor, as the Competition Bureau has testified, can MVNOs substitute for the positive impact that regional providers have had in increasing sustainable competition, investment, and declining prices. Justifying regulatory intervention requires compelling evidence that the benefits of such intervention clearly outweigh any negative consequences. The benefits of mandating MVNO wholesale access are purely speculative, and if they exist at all, are minimal and short-term. In contrast, the negative effects of mandated wholesale MVNO access on sustainable competition and investment are well established by the record of this proceeding and will have long-term negative impacts affecting all Canadians. These negative impacts have also been recognized time and time again by the Commission, which has concluded in past proceedings that the costs of mandated MVNO wireless access outweigh any potential benefits. Since those decisions, the benefits of facilities-based competition are even more evident, and the need for massive ongoing investment in innovation, infrastructure, and spectrum has only increased. The evidence on the record does not support mandating wholesale MVNO access. Thank you, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Commissioner McDonald.
Good afternoon and welcome. Your comments today and your submissions throughout this process have largely been consistent with statements that we've heard from the large facilities-based carriers across the country that are also members of your organization. So I'm not going to cover all of the same ground perhaps we have with other facilities-based providers, but if there are particular points where you potentially take a different view from that of some of your members, perhaps you might just want to outline that as we go through. I guess the first question I would have is one of the criticisms that has been levied against MVNOs is the fact that they don't invest in any infrastructure. But other parties have said, well, yes, they actually do. They invest in core network, they invest in billing systems, they hire people. Why are you of the view that such investments are not significant enough to warrant some merit in this proceeding?
Well, I'll start off with that. Just to address your first point, where you asked if we have any different views than our members, to let you know when those issues come up. We're not going to have any different views than our members today.
I was expecting that response.
Or I'd be in a lot of trouble. With regards to investment, when we talk investment, we talk about investment in building the world-class networks that Canadians have enjoyed, where we've got 99% of Canadians that have access to LTE networks, where we have some of the fastest networks in the world, second only behind South Korea. Those are the investments we're talking about. And where we see that investments that, from a particular point of view that I have, that where they will definitely not invest is for those Canadians that still do not have access to wireless networks. So if you're a Canadian out there today and you happen to be watching this at home and you do not have access to wireless networks, or you're still waiting for upgrades to your wireless networks, it's very important to know that mandating MVNO access, allowing MVNOs to have access to the incumbent networks, is going to do absolutely nothing to build out into those rural and remote communities where Canadians are still waiting to be able to be connected. And that's probably the biggest, one of the biggest issues that I have. They also don't do anything in terms of upgrading our networks, where we're on the verge of 5G, which, as we've heard, is going to be transformational. And perhaps I'll talk a little bit later, but even with 5G, with those upgrades, we're going to go into fixed wireless, which is even going to make it even more easier to be able to connect those Canadians that don't need it. So where my concern comes from is people out there that don't have access. MVNOs, mandating MVNOs is going to do absolutely nothing to help them.
If I could just add, I definitely agree with Rob. I think also, you heard this morning from Rogers where they talk about, I think 70% of their investments are in things like building roads, building towers, building that physical infrastructure. So certainly, depending on the model, an MVNO will have to make some investments. But those are sort of more in some operational things that they will need, that any business needs. But they're not contributing, as Rob mentioned, to actually building the physical infrastructure that's necessary to provide world-class service to Canadians.
Thank you for that. So given your viewpoints that investments should be focused on building networks, not necessarily investing in internal systems or a new core network for a potential MVNO, are there certain proposals from different parties that cause you more or less concern when talking about a mandated MVNO? Because if I'm looking at the range of possibilities, at one end of the spectrum we have what the Bureau has proposed, and then at the other end of the spectrum we have what perhaps a provider wishing to be a full MVNO would like to see as a result of this proceeding. So which ones give you more concern?
Well, obviously, we've stated quite clearly, as has our members, we're against any MVNO model. And I think, some have commented that maybe the Bureau model is less harmful. But I think what's key is that any type of intervention along that will still have potential negative impact. And the key is, the Bureau has created that model as part of this proceeding. But the focus of their report is really that facilities-based competition is working. The regional providers have provided additional competitive intensity. And basically, they're saying, Commission, whatever you do, don't do anything to hurt the regional providers. Even with that proposal, the regional providers aren't asking for that proposal. They're not asking for that. So, could it potentially, in theory, be less harmful than the others? Yes. But also, as we heard, there's many complexities to it, unanswered questions. Even the Bureau themselves indicated that, in response to some of your questions, that they weren't sure what the answers were. There maybe would need to be another proceeding, et cetera. So it's a theoretical model that even they said, they didn't say in the report it would work. They said it may work. So we're really against all the models because we don't think we need any of them. We think facilities-based competition is working and it's producing positive outcomes.
Thank you. Excuse me. One of the things that you, or one of the points that you tried to drive home in your submissions was around the negative financial impact that mandating MVNOs would have, particularly in the context of the rollout for 5G. So on that topic, I'm just wondering, in your original submission, you note the many benefits of 5G to transportation mobility solutions, precision agriculture, energy management, rural connectivity. Those would seem to be excellent lines of business that a 5G provider could leverage to offset any potential harm that MVNOs might create. Could you perhaps comment on that?
I'll start off. Well, just allow me to put things into context. For us to even get to where we want to be so that we can take advantage of 5G, it's going to take a $26 billion investment. We know that that is a massive investment that needs to be made by facilities-based providers. For us to, and then there's a lot of other steps along the way as well. But when we do get to that step, I think that the benefits that are going to come are going to be delivered to society. I did talk about, and in our opening remarks, how 5G will actually help with climate change. We see from some of the examples that you just used, whether or not it is smart grids, smart energy, less traffic on highways, reducing down our carbon footprint. There's a lot of things for us to get there. But when it comes to, again, I go back to MVNOs, they will do nothing to help us get there. Are there going to be other avenues to be able to gain perhaps revenue? It's unpredictable what's exactly going to happen with 5G. We know that what some of the use cases are, but in terms of exactly how that's all going to work, I think it's going to be an evolution, kind of like how we didn't predict a lot of the things that were going to come about when 4G arrived. So it's going to be an evolution before we start to see what some of those results could be.
Thank you. A couple of days ago, I was asking questions of a panel of former telecom executives, and I'm going to paraphrase, but the statement was made, the investments are going to happen. No provider would not invest in 5G. And that could very well be true, but I think the example that I used at the time was there will always be a business case to build in the GTA. There will always be a business case to build in Montreal, but there's an awful lot of Canada outside the larger centres. Could you perhaps give your thoughts on where the negative financial impact will most be felt from a network deployment standpoint?
Very good point. And I agree with your assessment that I think where the bigger components are going to be felt, and I addressed this a little bit earlier, is going to be on those Canadians that do not have access to networks, first of all, that are still waiting for 4G and LTE, that are still waiting on the hope of what fixed wireless and 5G could bring to those communities. It's also going to hinder the build-outs in rural areas. You heard from just Rogers this morning. They're going to look for areas where they can get a return on their dollars. But to go back to, and I watched the testimony of those 3 former telecom executives, and they're partially right. And I think you've heard this from all their members. There's still going to be build-outs that are going to happen. They're just not going to happen as fast as they could happen, which then leads to some major issues for Canada as a nation. Because you heard from Joe Natale this morning talking about we should be proud of our networks and how this is about nation building. And there is a race to 5G. And those countries that get there first are going to have the new jobs, the new apps, the new technologies. I don't want rural Atlantic Canada missing out on that, or the prairies missing out on that, or the north missing out on that. And so while build-outs may still happen, they will happen at a much slower pace. And if they happen at a much slower pace, then there's incremental costs that will happen because we're losing out on that growth that could deliver that. And I have just some quotes here from, and we've referenced it in our submissions, and you mentioned it, from our 5G report from Accenture, and it just has to do with rural connectivity, just to put things in perspective. And those that may not have broadband today or may not have wireless, and what 5G and the potential of fixed wireless is able to do. And it says here, studies have shown that a 10% increase in broadband penetration can achieve a 0.9% to a 1.5% increase in GDP growth. Applying these figures to Canadian rural regions show significant economic benefits. In Saskatchewan, a province with 296 rural municipalities and 33% of the population living in rural regions, only 75% of households have access to broadband services. In a scenario where the province achieves the Canadian government target of 95% broadband service availability, Saskatchewan can expect a potential increase in GDP of up to $1.2 billion. Similarly, the same marks in Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland and Labrador are $520 million and $430 million, respectively. Rural connectivity will become easier with 5G through fixed wireless. Slowing down those investments will mean that they'll get those investments years later down the road. And the incremental cost to that is something that concerns me from someone who comes from a small jurisdiction in this country, that we cannot afford to be left behind. We need to be able to get there together. We need to be able to make sure that Canada is competitive all over the world, and that no matter where you live in our country, you have every possible opportunity to compete with anywhere else in the world, let alone with Canadians, regardless of where they live.
So still on the topic of 5G and making sure that Canada is at the forefront, some parties have indicated that we're already lagging behind. And one of the suggestions that's been put forward in this proceeding was the possibility of a working group being established to sort through some of the many complexities that are going to be involved in the rollout. I believe, and I may use the wrong term, but you also have a 5G collaborative group who share thoughts within your organization. But pretty much universally, all of the service providers have said that the working group won't provide any benefits and may in some cases actually slow down progress. So what are your thoughts on a 5G working group?
Yeah, as you mentioned, there's divergence of opinion among carriers. I think the majority of our members have indicated that they're not in favor of some type of mandated working group, and they have concerns with it, and whether it's things like the potential sharing of confidential information or just even the feasibility or workability of it. And others indicated it may have some merit. I mean, definitely collaboration itself is important in our industry, and it goes on every day. And we know that carriers work with municipalities on issues, et cetera. But, you know, in terms of whether that should be a mandated working group, I mean, I think we'll let the comments of our members that are on the record stand. We don't, you know, as you said, there's a divergence of opinion, so we don't have anything to add to that.
If I can, sorry,
Go ahead.
If I can just add to that, because you talked about where we are with 5G and are we behind other jurisdictions in the world. I like to point out, I remember I was at a conference in the U.S. and I was listening to a panel, and this was when I first started my job, and we like to talk about how great our LTE networks are and how we're world leaders. And there was a panel on, and there was they were talking about 5G, and they were talking about how they were the first to get there to 4G. And I said to my staff, is that true? And they said, yeah, it's true. You know, the U.S. was the first country to get to 4G. And here we are a number of years later, and Canada's networks are twice as fast as the United States. We reach more on a percentage-wise of Canadians. And then there's a great quote from Open Signal that I like to use, where they say, there's no question Canada is a global 4G superpower today. That likely means there are few other countries better prepared than Canada to deploy the 5G networks of the future. There's a caveat to that. And that caveat is that if we do not have a regulatory environment that supports facilities-based competition, then we cannot help deliver on that to help make sure that maybe we will be a little bit behind in terms of 5G, but that in 5 years' time, Open Signal will say, isn't it great that Canada is a 5G superpower today? And I think that that's what we should try to strive for when we look at our regulatory framework.
I have a question on building networks in just a second, but before I go there, do you have specific thoughts around if a working group were established, who should be at that table? Obviously the carriers, I would assume municipalities. I said, are there other parties that you think should be around that table if indeed they are invited to that table?
No, I mean, I think you've hit the main ones, but I think as Rogers mentioned this morning, part of the issue is that there is uncertainty regarding the sort of regulation of certain things like access to municipal infrastructure, passive infrastructure, access to electrical utility poles, et cetera. And so it's probably, you know, the concerns I know that Rogers expressed anyway, and I think some others have, was that it's more difficult to have that kind of discussion without those rules and those frameworks being worked out.
I have some experience with working groups, and one of the challenges can be, well, one, not having the right people at the table, but two, having too many people at the table to actually get everything accomplished. Is that a concern when we're talking about the number of municipalities that will be involved in a 5G rollout? They all may have different priorities, very different circumstances. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we have roughly, I guess, the same number of municipalities as when rolling out 4G, but the issues are probably more complex now because of, you know, small cell architectures, et cetera. You know, we know that our carriers have good relationships with municipalities, obviously some relationships better than others. Our hope is that as you know, we're still very much in the infancy of 5G, and a lot of these, you know, sort of best practices and things like that are still being worked out. And we hope as deployments begin, those best practices will be identified, will be shared across municipalities, et cetera, and that it will make the process more streamlined and work better. But you're right. I mean, it's always a challenge because every municipality has, you know, different concerns from their citizens, has different priorities, has different economies of scale. So they may, you know, a large city may have a department dedicated to it, whereas a smaller municipality may have somebody who it's, you know, part of their job. So those challenges are very real.
On the topic of building a 5G network for Canada, I would assume it's cheaper, faster, and easier if one network were built as opposed to multiple networks serving the needs of each individual carrier. So I'm wondering, could I get your thoughts on a potential mandate for all carriers to build a 5G network to serve Canadians' needs, and where the challenges might be with such a proposal? Other countries have gone down that road, which is why I asked the question.
Sorry, what was the last part, sorry, that you just said?
I was just going to say, what might the challenges be with a mandate for all the carriers to work together and build one 5G network as opposed to building one individually for each of them?
Right, and I think, though, you said something about others have gone
Oh,
down
other countries, particularly South Korea and Germany, have received a mandate that all carriers will build a single network.
Yeah, I did hear that earlier in the proceeding, and I was looking into it before. Your information obviously may be better than mine. I'm not sure in Germany that it's an actual mandate. I thought it was basically cooperation among three of the carriers who are, in one case, I think they've entered into a memorandum of understanding. Another one, they're exploring discussions, and I think TELUS's expert talked a little bit about that in terms of sharing some of the building to address white spots, areas of the country that are not receiving coverage. But obviously, I stand to be corrected if I'm not accurate there. And I think part of that was actually arose out of concerns with some of the recent happenings in the German market, where with the spectrum auctions, the recent spectrum auctions, were incredibly inflated in terms of the cost for the 5G spectrum. And it basically, the comments that came out of the CEOs of the carriers were essentially, you know, our whole investment model's broken. We don't have money to invest in infrastructure. With this money, we could have built out in these areas. And so it was really a solution they came to, not because they felt it was the best thing to do or the best thing for the German people or to provide the best networks. It was really driven out of a necessity. South Korea as well, I don't know too much about that situation other than I would say that, you know, South Korea is a much different country. Almost half the population lives in the greater Seoul area. Their population density is roughly around 16,000 people per square kilometer, whereas if you look at the GTA area, it's like 800. And so they have some very real issues in terms of building the type of small cell architecture in a relatively small area to serve that many people. And so again, I think it's more of a come out of a necessity rather than something seen as that it will drive the, you know, the best best network experience. One of the strengths of Canada is having multiple networks that allow facilities-based carriers to compete based on network performance, differentiation, and I think in 5G that'll be even more key because we're not talking just about providing connectivity. We've heard earlier speakers talk about the diverse set of capabilities that 5G will deliver, and that will enable carriers to differentiate themselves from others even more. So, you know, I don't think a mandated network is really something that's in the benefits of Canada.
Okay, thank you. Regardless of whether we're living in a 4G or a 5G world, I think everyone could agree it's important for Canadians, particularly perhaps more vulnerable Canadians, to have access to the communication services they need. And we've talked a lot about the potential to mandate a particular plan that would be available to low-income Canadians. We've talked about low-cost plan that would be available to all Canadians. We've talked about, and others, and myself included, have referred to it as the ISED model, but it includes the partnership with, I think, last count, 13 different service providers that have come together in the Connecting Families initiative. If we were looking for a way to potentially solve that gap in the market, if indeed it does exist, what's the best vehicle to do that with?
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, you know, our view and our members' view is that right now the market is serving Canadians in terms of providing a broad range of plans at different price points, plan attributes as well. But we certainly heard the discussion of different interveners and some of the questioning from the Commission about, well, isn't there still potentially a segment of Canada who simply, you know, just does not find wireless affordable, and your reference to the Connecting Canadian Families program on the wireline side. And I think as Rogers mentioned this morning, I mean, our industry is always open to have conversations about ways that can be addressed. But I think the need for a mandate is not there. I think that you know, some of the plans that have been proposed as part of this proceeding, as other members of ours have mentioned, are really not economically feasible and don't reflect the true cost of delivering a service. But in terms of having an engagement with industry to look at whether something could be put together, I think is fair. I don't think you can simply map the Connecting Families program to wireless because there's different economies. It's a different, on one side it's connectivity to a family or a household versus connectivity to individuals. There's device costs. So there's a lot of issues and complexities that would had to be worked out. But I think that would be the way to do it. And again, along the lines of it would have to be strictly means tested, et cetera, because you don't want to distort the whole market. You don't want to totally destroy the economics of the market and impact investment, et cetera. But you do want to look for ways if there's a manageable way to address the needs of Canadians.
And totally agree, and those are great points. And as Eric mentioned, we don't believe there's a need to mandate. Industry is open to conversations. You hear, our members are always looking for better ways to find new customers. But for those that perhaps need help in our society, I think that yes, obviously you've heard from some of our members saying that they are open. There is another avenue, and I think I heard you asking some questions about this the other day. And with my background, I can say that provinces do receive a transfer payment from the federal government specifically designed for provinces themselves to decide on whether or not the needs of their citizens are being met to help them in areas where they may not be able to afford things. And it was the health and social transfer that was divvied up, I think, in 2004, 2005. Now it's the Canada social transfer, and within the provinces, there's different names for social assistance programs all across the provinces, but that could be another area that to help make sure that those Canadians that need the help are able to get it.
Thank you for that. If we did decide to mandate a low-income plan, do you think that should also come with a requirement that it would be promoted in the same way, a low-cost plan, that low-cost plan should be promoted in a similar way as carriers would promote other plans in their market? Visual displays at kiosks, same size font on their website, that sort of thing.
Well, first of all, I think that there are inherent dangers in mandating a plan that is below cost and that could distort the entire market. Obviously, I'm somewhat paraphrasing Mr. Natali from this morning, but also at the same time, if you remember, Lee Bragg, who represents a smaller private company, said that they had a program at one point and that there was very little uptake on it, so they got rid of it. I think that I go to our two ways that I've described it. I think that if you want to sit down with industry and perhaps have some discussions, or the second avenue would be to ensure that that provinces do have the mechanisms in place to help bridge those gaps that exist within our society.
Thank you. Just one final question, and then my colleagues may have questions of their own. And it's a bit unfair to ask you, but I'm going to anyway. Just because you have a large number of members who compete with each other, who attract customers away from each other with enticing offers. We have talked a lot in this proceeding about win-back activity, especially what could be described as somewhat aggressive behavior of a service provider calling one of their soon-to-be former clients upon receiving the porting request while the customer is still in the store. Do you think that there should be any guidelines put around that activity to, one, allow the customer to still take advantage of the advantageous offers that may be put in front of them, but protect the service provider who has just unwrapped the $2,000 iPhone?
Yeah. Yes, we heard the discussion about win-backs. I mean, again, I'll just say, one of the concerns was brought by one of our members, and it was, I guess, opposed by other members of ours. So, we don't have a view as an association on that issue. It's not something we talk about at the CWTA, so we don't have anything to add to the record on that.
Fair enough. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Commissioner Barron, pardon me.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the responses to the questions. I have a couple more. I heard you say that Canadian networks are twice as fast. And we've heard in the course of this proceeding that Canadians consume less data generally than international benchmarks, so that the networks are possibly less congested, which makes it so that the speeds are better. We've also, so I'd like your comments on that. And also, we've heard from some of your members that they refer to the Canadian networks as higher quality. So I want to just ask you what is meant by the term higher quality? Is it the equipment that's different? What accounts for Canadian networks being of higher quality?
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of congestion or capacity, I think we've heard those comments as well. But we also heard from the facilities-based providers is they essentially build to the demand and the anticipated demand. So this notion that there's a whole bunch of excess capacity just sitting there that they happen to spend millions of dollars in building, but nobody's using it, I think that's a fallacy. In terms of what quality means, quality is more than just speed. It's reliability. There was a reference, I think it was this morning, to one of the Open Signal reports they did on the performance of networks in rural Canada. And they looked at things not just speeds compared to other nations, but they looked in terms of availability, so essentially the expansion of the network or how broad it is, and also its reliability. So those are some of the elements that go into quality, but it's everything that makes up the consumer's experience. So, you know, whether it's the reception on a call, whether it's how quickly your device connects to the network, it's how many devices can connect to a network. So there's a lot of elements that go into quality.
And then the other part of your question, I'll paraphrase, I guess, some of my members in terms of data usage, and that is that, you know, you are starting to see today incredible growth, and you just heard with the unlimited plans that are taking place now. We also have a higher rate than some. I heard a comparison between Canada and Norway, you know, in terms of Wi-Fi availability, and Wi-Fi availability makes a big difference there too. So I don't think there's any one direct answer to why our data usage is lower. I think there's a whole lot, but I think you're going to see, and you've heard this from our members, is an incredible amount of growth. And we've seen an incredible amount of growth over the last number of years, but I would say if we're here in another couple of years, it won't be an average of 2.5. That average will be much higher.
And just to add to that is I don't think Rogers mentioned it this morning, but I think it was one of their submissions that or actually it may have been as part of their financial earnings conference calls, that you know, they're seen on their unlimited plans, usage of those subscribers going up to average like 7 or 8 gigabits. And obviously, as Mr. Natali said this morning as well, they're getting ready and anticipating much higher growth because of the capability that 5G will bring.
Thank you. So my second question, you talked about the dangers of mandating low-cost plans that are below cost. Yesterday, we spoke with Quebec that operates the Videotron service, and they mentioned that there are $35 2 gig plans that are widely available in the Quebec market, and these are not plans that are targeted at low-income groups, so they're widely available. So, and when we asked Quebecor about the costs of operating a network in Quebec, their response was that they were similar to the costs of operating networks elsewhere in Canada. So my question to you is it fair to say that that price point of $35 for a 2 gig plan is not below cost?
I'll let Eric fill in if I don't go into anything too technical here, but just basically from the testimonies that have taken place, and I love to support my members, and I believe that if you heard the reason why the rates are lower in Quebec is, according to Mr. Pelledo, is because Quebecor is offering that competition, and they've been in the market a little bit longer. And it's the facilities-based competition with the fourth player that is allowing those rates to go lower. My argument would be allow those new entrants to have the opportunity to continue to grow, the Shaws, the Eastlinks, the ExploreNets, so that all the other jurisdictions can get to the same level and start to drive down prices after they've been in the market a little bit longer. That's one of the arguments that you hear. In terms of prices, you know, I take it from what all our members say is that, you know, they're trying their best to find those low-cost plans. We know that in Quebec, the rates are a little lower. I would say that you heard from these proceedings that the rates in Saskatchewan were a little bit lower a few years ago, and then now it's becoming more of an equilibrium across the country. I think that if we allow facilities-based competition to continue and encourage the new entrants to continue to grow by not mandating MVNOs, that we'll see more of an equilibrium as well.
Okay, so I understand that it's really a competitive issue to get the price lower, but that in terms of the costs, that costing a low-cost plan at that level would not be below cost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously we don't have a lot of discussions with our members about pricing, et cetera, for obvious reasons. You know, they're competitors, and so we don't talk about those things, and we don't have a lot of visibility into different cost structures that companies have. I'll note that offer, though, you know, is from Fizz, their flanker brand, which is a purely sort of digital, light touch with the consumer. So, I mean, that has a lower cost structure. And I think every carrier is a little bit different. I mean, Eastlink said they couldn't offer them because they would, or at least the ones who were proposed, because it's cost prohibitive. And also, you know, I even have to note that when you asked some of the interveners who, you know, are advocating for MVNO access or aspiring to be MVNOs, when they were asked, would you make these plans available? And to paraphrase, you know, the response was, well, not if they're below our costs. And those are the people that are holding themselves out as, you know, people who will serve those markets better than the facilities-based carriers. At the end of the day, costs, you can't look at price without looking at cost, but we can't really answer about one particular member and what their structure is.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your submissions and for taking the time to appear and answer our questions. I bid you a good afternoon and turn it, Madame Secrétaire.
Merci. I will now ask the Alton Regional Police Service to come to the presentation table.